In the heart of an isolated wildlife sanctuary nestled deep within a dense forest, an atmosphere of quiet anticipation had settled. The sanctuary, surrounded by towering trees and thick underbrush, seemed to hold its breath as the days stretched into weeks. The faint rustle of leaves and the occasional distant call of birds were the only sounds that punctuated the stillness. A young panda named May moved with deliberate slowness through the bamboo grove. Her once playful, curious nature had been replaced with a quiet intensity. Her glossy black and white coat shimmered against the green backdrop as she plodded along, stopping every so often to nibble at the tender shoots of bamboo. But something was different now. The peaceful routine of grazing and resting had been interrupted by the growing weight of her belly, and with it, an instinctual tension had begun to build within her. The caretakers in the sanctuary, a small team of dedicated conservationists, had been preparing for this moment for months. May was about to give birth to her first cub. She was older than the usual age for a panda to give birth, having been brought to the sanctuary after years of failed attempts at breeding in the wild. The sanctuary was as remote as it was serene. There were no bustling crowds, no tourists wandering through the forest, only the animals and the people who cared for them. May's care was entrusted to one of the sanctuary's most experienced biologists, Sophie. Sophie, who had worked with pandas for years, was the only one May had come to trust. Sophie had spent countless hours observing the panda, watching her reactions to the subtle changes in her environment, and anticipating every possible need. The days were growing colder now, and as May's pregnancy neared its conclusion, the air itself seemed to tighten, heavy with expectation. Sophie had taken up a position in a small hut at the edge of May's enclosure, nestled in the shadows of the forest. Through the thick glass windows, Sophie could barely make out the silhouette of the panda, moving slowly under the towering bamboo stalks. The anticipation was palpable. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest darkened, and the sounds of the night began to stir. The wind picked up, howling through the trees in gusts that sent leaves spiraling into the air. May's movements were slow, almost deliberate, as she made her way to the secluded corner of her enclosure. This was where she felt safe now, where she had spent most of her pregnancy. It was there that she had built a nest of bamboo shoots and soft moss, gathering everything she needed for the cub's arrival. Sophie's watch had become more frequent as the days passed, her eyes drained from staring through the glass. The shadows outside grew longer, and she could feel the intensity of the moment coming closer. As night descended, the quiet of the forest seemed to deepen, as if the very air had become charged with energy. A stillness had settled, broken only by the occasional snip of twig or the rustling of underbrush as nocturnal creatures stirred to life. Inside her enclosure, May settled onto the soft bed of bamboo, curling her body protectively. She moved slightly, shifting her weight, but remained calm. Sophie watched, her breath held, waiting for any sign of labor. The panda's belly had grown round with the life inside her, and her movements had become more sluggish, her breathing deeper and more deliberate. May had been through this before, but the burden of first-time motherhood weighed heavily on her fragile frame. She had no idea what was to come. The wind outside howled again, shaking the trees, and Sophie heard the unmistakable sound of a twig snapping underfoot. Her heart skipped. She thought she had heard a growl. But there was no time to check. Her eyes were fixed on the panda now. May was beginning to shift uneasily. Sophie watched as the panda suddenly rose, her movements jagged and unsteady. May's eyes were wide, and her ears twitched at every rustle, her body tensing. Then, a soft whimper pierced the night air. May's body was starting to tremble, and Sophie's pulse quickened. The labor had begun. The forest outside continued its low murmurs, the wind rustling the leaves in erratic gusts as May's body buckled under the strain of labor. Sophie watched through the glass, her heart racing. May's breathing had become more rapid, more strained. The panda circled her nest, pausing to lean against a nearby tree for support, then faltering again. Her eyes were filled with confusion and fear, and for a moment, Sophie could sense May's isolation. Alone in this vast, unbroken forest. Sophie's hands gripped the edge of the window, her gaze fixed on the panda, urging her silently, willing her to push through. The hours stretched on, but May's progress seemed slow, her labor long and painful. It was then, as May let out another low whimper, that Sophie heard it. A sound that didn't belong. The unmistakable crackle of branches breaking underfoot. And then, a rustle. A heavy, deliberate movement from the dense forest just beyond the enclosure. Something, or someone, was close. Sophie's breath hitched, her mind racing. A predator? Or perhaps another animal wandering into the sanctuary grounds? The tension inside the sanctuary grew thick, a sense of urgency pressing against Sophie's chest as she moved swiftly to the door of the small hut. She could see nothing outside, just the oppressive blackness of the forest, but the sounds were unmistakable. There was movement. Something was out there, near May's enclosure. Panic began to rise, but Sophie forced it down. She couldn't leave May alone now. May needed her. Sophie's heart pounded in her chest as she turned back to the glass, but her eyes widened in disbelief. A cub. A tiny, pale cub had emerged from May's body, its fur slick with the fluids of birth, its tiny mouth gaping in the cold air. May, despite her exhaustion, nuzzled her baby gently, licking it, her trembling paws moving cautiously over the tiny creature. Sophie exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she was holding, but the relief was fleeting. Her eyes darted back to the dark forest outside. The rustling had grown louder. May's baby, a male cub, was weak, struggling to breathe, its limbs twitching faintly. May's gaze was now wild, frantic, as she attempted to position the cub for feeding. But then, as Sophie watched in horror, the cub let out a weak cry, and the light from the nearby lamp seemed to flicker. Another growl. This time there was no mistaking it. A large figure was stalking the perimeter of the enclosure. Sophie could feel the presence of something else, something predatory, waiting in the wings. Sophie's eyes widened as she dashed to the door, gripping the handle with trembling hands. The growls grew louder, followed by a low thud, as something huge and powerful struck the fence surrounding May's enclosure. The panda, despite the exhausting labor she had just gone through, suddenly rose to her feet, her eyes wide, filled with fear. She backed protectively over her cub, instinctively drawing him closer to her body. A shadow passed in the distance, moving just beyond the reach of the light. Sophie held her breath, and then, to her shock, a figure emerged from the darkness. A male panda. It was the cube's father, the male that had been brought into the sanctuary months earlier in hopes of facilitating May's breeding. His arrival was unexpected, and yet, somehow, it was the answer May had needed. He had been there all along, hiding in the shadows of the forest, waiting for the right moment. The male panda moved slowly toward May, his movements slow and deliberate. May's eyes locked with his, and for a moment the two pandas shared an unspoken understanding. The tension in the air lifted, replaced by an overwhelming, almost peaceful energy. The male approached cautiously, sniffing at the cub. May, exhausted but protective, watched him closely, but allowed him to nuzzle the newborn gently. Sophie watched in awe, unable to tear her eyes away from the miracle unfolding before her. The mysterious presence in the woods hadn't been a predator after all. It was the father, part of a natural cycle. In the silence that followed, the wind began to settle. The forest grew quiet once more. Sophie could hear the faintest sounds of the cub's breathing, slow but steady, as May curled protectively around him. The father panda remained close, ever watchful, ensuring their safety. The miracle had arrived, not just in the form of the cub, but in the quiet understanding between these two creatures, brought together by fate. The night had unfolded into something far more beautiful than anyone could have anticipated. And the cub, fragile but alive, had finally found his place in the world. The forest outside remained still, almost serene now, as the full moon illuminated the clearing where May and her newborn cub rested. The male panda, his black and white coat a stark contrast against the dim moonlit landscape, stood guard by May. His eyes, calm yet vigilant, scanned the periphery of the enclosure as though he could sense every movement in the shadows. The rustling noises had ceased, the threat of danger fading into the background. Inside the hut, Sophie let out a long, steadying breath. Her heart, which had been racing just moments before, began to slow. She knew that the arrival of the cub, while miraculous, was far from the end of the story. In this wilderness, survival was not guaranteed, and the real challenge was just beginning. Yet, for now, there was peace. Sophie remained at the window, her eyes fixed on the family of pandas before her. May, still exhausted but now comforted by the presence of the male, nursed her cub, her movements slow but gentle. The cub's tiny mouth clung desperately to her teat, instinctively drawing in the rich, nourishing milk that would be his lifeline in the early days. May's eyes softened as she looked down at him, a tenderness in her gaze that Sophie had never seen before in her. It was as if the bond between mother and child had formed instantly, despite the fear, despite the labor, and despite the moments of uncertainty. The male panda, though not physically close to May as she nursed, remained watchful, his gaze constantly shifting to the trees in the darkened corners of the enclosure. His role was clear: protector. As Sophie watched the pandas from her small, dimly lit refuge, a quiet sense of gratitude washed over her. May had done it. Against all odds, she had given birth to a healthy cub, and now this father, this mysterious figure who had remained hidden, possibly watching from afar, had come at just the right moment to help safeguard their future. Sophie couldn't help but feel a deep connection to these creatures. Her role had always been to protect them, to ensure their survival, but it was moments like this, moments when nature unfolded its raw beauty, that reminded her why she had chosen this life. The sanctuaries, the long hours spent caring for the animals, the endless checks and reports, were all part of a delicate dance that balanced between the known and the unknown. And sometimes the unknown brought unexpected miracles. The hours passed in a quiet trance, the panda family tucked together in the corner of the enclosure, their rhythmic breathing the only sound in the night. Sophie, though exhausted from her own watch, found herself unable to look away. As the moon climbed higher in the sky, casting silver beams through the canopy, a new dawn seemed to be taking shape. As the night wore on, and the first hints of light began to filter through the thick trees, the forest still felt heavy with the weight of the miracle that had just unfolded. But just as Sophie began to relax, just as she allowed herself to believe that the worst was behind them, the atmosphere shifted again. A faint sound, barely perceptible, reached Sophie's ears, a crunching of leaves, a faint snap of twigs. At first she thought it was nothing, the forest itself settling into the early morning. But then the sound grew louder, more insistent. It was a heavy, rhythmic sound, like the tread of something large moving steadily through the underbrush. Sophie's heart began to pound again. Her breath quickened. This time it wasn't the soft shuffle of wind or distant animals, nor the natural rhythm of the night. No, this was something different, something far more deliberate. Her eyes darted toward the pandas, who remained oblivious to the approaching danger. May's attention was fully absorbed by the cub. Her protective instincts focused entirely on him. The sound drew closer, louder now. Unmistakable. Sophie's body tensed. It wasn't just one animal. There were several. A group of predators, perhaps? Was it a pack of wolves, or maybe wild dogs, drawn to the scent of the vulnerable panda cub? Sophie's mind raced, her fingers pressing against the cold glass. But then, through the thin line of trees, Sophie caught sight of a figure. It wasn't a predator, nor any animal she recognized at first. A human. A man, dressed in weathered camouflage, emerged from the trees at the edge of the enclosure. He moved with purpose, his eyes scanning the pandas, but his face shadowed under a heavy hood. He was not someone Sophie had seen before, not someone connected to the sanctuary. Her breath caught in her throat as the realization hit her. This man did not belong here. Sophie's pulse quickened. She instinctively moved to the door of the hut, her mind racing. What was he doing here? Was he a poacher? Had someone stumbled onto the sanctuary grounds, attracted by the rare birth of a panda cub? Her hand trembled as it gripped the door handle, but she froze for a moment, watching the figure. The man stepped closer to the edge of the enclosure, his eyes fixed on May and her cub. He knelt down slowly, as though observing them from a distance, but not in the way a poacher would approach. Something about his posture, his steady, almost reverential movements, stopped Sophie. He wasn't rushing, wasn't taking any immediate action. He was simply watching. Sophie's mind churned, but she knew she had to act quickly. She stepped out into the open, making herself visible to the man. Her voice, though silent in the distance, carried a message of authority. She wasn't going to allow anyone, no one, to threaten the panda family she had fought so hard to protect. But as the man turned toward her, Sophie's heart nearly stopped. His face, now revealed in the faint light of dawn, was etched with concern, his eyes wide with genuine surprise. This wasn't the hardened expression of a poacher or hunter. No, this was the face of someone who, like Sophie, cared deeply about these animals. "I'm sorry," the man mouthed, his voice not audible, but his intent clear. Sophie, in that split second, understood. He wasn't a threat. The man, a researcher from a neighboring sanctuary, had been tracking May's progress in secret. He had come to see the miracle firsthand, but had underestimated the speed with which May's cub arrived. He had come too late to warn Sophie of his presence, but not too late to ensure that he remained far enough away to cause no disruption. The silence between them stretched, and for a moment, the tension that had built between them dissolved. Sophie nodded slightly, signaling her understanding. The research team had been monitoring the pandas for years, and this man had merely been seeking a chance to witness the birth, to document it from afar. With a final glance at the pandas, the man backed away slowly, disappearing into the forest once more. His mission fulfilled. The sound of the man's departure faded into the wind as May and her cub remained undisturbed. Sophie turned back to the panda family, her heart still racing but filled with a quiet sense of resolve. The night had been long, full of surprises, both wonderful and unsettling. But now, the cub was safe. May was safe, and the miracle of new life had taken root in the heart of the sanctuary. Sophie stood there for a while, watching the cub nuzzle against May's side, her protective embrace keeping him close. As the first light of dawn filtered through the trees, the forest seemed to come alive with new energy. The sounds of birds calling, the soft rustle of leaves in the breeze, all of it was a reminder of the delicate balance of life in this remote, protected place. The miracle had not only been May's journey, but also Sophie's, a journey that would continue, ever watchful, ever patient. For now, though, there was peace. And that, for the moment, was enough. The days that followed the birth of May's cub were filled with the quiet rhythm of the sanctuary. The forest around it seemed to pulse with new life, animals in their native habitat going about their days, the wind rustling through the trees, and the distant calls of other creatures echoing across the landscape. For Sophie, the events of the past few days still felt like a surreal blur. Her exhaustion from the long watch over May and her cub had slowly faded, replaced by an overwhelming sense of pride and relief. May and her cub were thriving, and the male panda, who had remained near them without intrusion, had proven to be a steadfast protector. Everything seemed to be falling into place. But Sophie couldn't shake the memory of the man who had appeared from the shadows. The mystery of his arrival and his strange, wordless apology remained with her. She had tried to reach out to him, but he had vanished quickly back into the forest. No one at the sanctuary had any information about a new researcher working nearby. Sophie's mind circled back to one unsettling thought. Who had he been? Really? And why had he seemed so intent on observing the pandas from a distance, only to retreat without speaking?